Hello, everyone. This is a makeup lecture from my Thinking Critically About New Media class. This is a very dense article, actually, on autonomy that I'll just say is fairly redundant. Could be significantly shorter than it is. I'm going to capture a few of the highlights here. This is stuff that I would have covered in class, but because I'll be away at a conference, we will not have class in person on this particular day. So the article is called Social Media and Its Negative Effects on Autonomy. There is a ton of stuff at the beginning of this article about autonomy, broadly construed, all the different types of autonomy, all kinds of different little distinctions and technical clarifications. Frankly, for our purposes, you all don't need to know that stuff. That gets into material that is, I think, at best only tangentially related, really, to the main points of the article. The main question of the article is, what effects does social media have on autonomy? And kind of a related question, like, are the effects on autonomy morally objectionable? So the question, what is autonomy? My sort of broad definition for it, for our purposes here, is the ability for a person to freely choose what they want to do and act accordingly. So in other words, it involves making choices about what course of action you want to take and then actually being able to follow through on that choice. Now, if you look this up, like if you just Google this term, it'll generally tell you that autonomy is about the capacity for self-governance, but I'm trying to spell out here what it means to engage in the practice of self-governance, right? What are you doing? You're making a choice and you're acting in accordance with what you want to do, right? With the choice that you've made. So here are a few general things that can undermine your autonomy. First, if you're misinformed or you're lied to or you're deceived. When you have inaccurate information, you cannot make an informed choice about what you want to do, and so your choice isn't really free. You might still wind up making, like, it might be the case that when you get accurate information, you think, oh, I would have still made the same choice, but it doesn't change the fact that the choice you made in that moment was not fully autonomous because you didn't have accurate information on which to make a decision. Whoops, let's skip that one. Not go to that one just yet. Second one is, if you are physically prevented, like say being imprisoned, if you're physically prevented from doing something that you decide you want to do, then your autonomy is obviously being compromised. I don't think that needs a detailed explanation. If you are, however, not imprisoned or outright physically prevented from doing something, but you are coerced or threatened or otherwise pressured to do something, that also compromises your autonomy. Again, the issue here is that your choice, what you are choosing to do, is not totally free, right? You're not really motivated to maybe act on what you really want to do because you're afraid of some potential punishment or penalty that you might suffer. And the last one is if you have your values in some way manipulated. So if you have, if you are influenced in some and we want to be careful here because you can be influenced in ways that are consistent with autonomy, like being rationally persuaded to change your mind about something. That doesn't mean your autonomy was undermined. We freely, choose to alter our behavior, say, all the time. And that even if it was at like a friend's suggestion or something, that doesn't mean that our autonomy was compromised, right? That's not what we're talking about. When we're talking about manipulation of a person's values, we're talking about a situation where there was some kind of, say, one great example would probably be indoctrination, right? So if you expose, especially younger people, to specific ideas and present them as factual when in fact they aren't, or when they are debatable, say, and create an environment in which there's a sort of social norm and expectation that they will hold those beliefs and values, they're much more likely to grow up to endorse those beliefs and values. But they didn't really choose to have those, to follow those ideals freely. They were, in a sense, manipulated into having those values. In those kinds of situations, again, your autonomy is compromised. There are other ways beyond these four things that your autonomy can be compromised, but these are just some general things. Whenever you are impeded from making a free choice, or you can make free choice but you can't really act in accordance with it, your autonomy in some sense is being compromised. So what's the connection here to social media? This is the main topic of the article. I'm not going to go into a ton of depth on any of these particular points because, again, I think that the article is a little bit redundant in some of the things that it says. A lot of the stuff overlaps. The other factor here is that a lot of the items that show up on the author's list, these are things we've already talked about in this class before. We've already talked, for example, about how social media can manipulate people's choices because of its propensity for generating addictive behavior. We've already talked about ways in which social media seems to affect people's attitudes about certain things, how it negatively impacts, for instance, girls' perceptions of beauty and body image, right? So you'll see some of the stuff that we've already talked about in the course pop up in this list, but let's just get into it. The first thing I'm going to mention, this actually is not explicitly stated in the article, but I do want to point out that there is at least one dimension where social media increases our autonomy because it provides us with an additional means of communication and recreation. These are things we can voluntarily choose to do. People are typically not forced or coerced into having a social media account. There can be situations where there are professional or social pressures to have a social media account, but for a lot of people, it's a voluntary choice at some level for whether or not you want to make an account and maintain it. And it provides you with an additional form of keeping in touch with people and browsing your newsfeed or seeing what people are up to or whatever. Now, as here's where we start getting into the author's content. Social media decreases our autonomy by spreading disinformation. So thinking back to the list of ways your autonomy can be compromised, one way is when you are misinformed. The various ways in which disinformation spreads online, especially through social media, is one way in which your autonomy can be undermined because you can wind up acting on information that you thought was true, but it in fact was false. Another thing that social media does is it can alter what we perceive as valuable in the world. It can alter our perceptions of beauty, of social status, of the legitimacy of wealth. It can alter our political beliefs. Because the way that we're exposed to information on social media, we're generally sort of fed things by algorithms that have been created to give us content that we're more likely to peruse. Right? Because the more stuff we peruse, the more likely we are to see advertisements that will generate revenue for the social media platform, whichever one we're using. So because our exposure here on social media can affect what we perceive as valuable, and because we aren't fully in control of what we're being exposed to, say in the advertising or in the content of our news feeds, there's an extent here to which our autonomy is being compromised a bit. Another one that the authors bring up is that social media decreases our autonomy by exploiting user data without our consent. There's a big section on this in the paper. To give a summary of the debate that they talk about, a lot of whether or not this is a violation of people's autonomy depends on what standards you think have to be met for informed consent to their sort of user, their terms of service and user agreements and so forth. The core concern, though, is that in a lot of instances, users don't really get to choose how their data winds up being used. There are also just instances where there have been data breaches, or we've found out that, ways in which the data was being used that seems just inconsistent with the terms of service or user policies that people have agreed to. Those cases at least look like they are clearly violations of user autonomy. Just to be clear, the violation here is that your choice about how to share your data and what data you are willing to share is not being honored, right? Or the choice that you're making about that is not really an informed choice. Like, that's kind of what the issues are. But whether or not this is like a common thing across a lot of social media networks is going to depend on how high you set the bar for informed consent. If you set that bar pretty low, then I guess I would say a lot of social media companies probably aren't using people's data in inappropriate ways, with the exception of these obvious data breaches and things like that. But at least in contexts I'm familiar with, such as medical ethics, the criteria for informed consent is fairly high. And the higher, the more conditions you have to be met, the more critically informed you think a person has to be to sign the agreement and have it count as informed consent, then the more likely it is that social media platforms are, in an unjustified way, compromising user autonomy. Now, the fifth thing that comes up is social media decreases autonomy by controlling how our attention is allocated. So this basically just gets down to how algorithms direct what we see. So if you log into, say, YouTube, a lot of content that you will be presented with is recommended to you based on an algorithm about what you have viewed before. Your Facebook news feed is curated according to things that you have viewed before. There are ways to manipulate these algorithms by clicking on specific types of content and being conscientious about like what you're looking at and such. But for the most part, a lot of stuff that we get fed on social media sites is not stuff that we personally chose. And the stuff that we get exposed to doesn't always reflect things that we consciously endorse. And this is especially true of personalized advertising or content that gets recommended to us but winds up actually being fallacious or untrue. There are also lots of ways in which users are simply manipulated. And some of this stuff overlaps with other stuff that I've already mentioned. The first one is users are sometimes manipulated because they are deceived. And the most obvious way in which they are deceived is if they are, say, reading fake news or getting redirected to misinformation. Then they're being deceived by the platform into thinking that certain things are true when they are in fact false. Another method of manipulation is altering users' ideals, values, and attitudes. This can be done in very, very subtle ways. Our brain is always making implicit associations between different things, even if we're not consciously aware of what's going on. So there are ways in which exposure to certain kinds of media representation of certain ideals or values or attitudes people have about certain things changes how you perceive that sort of stuff. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but one of the most clearly demonstrable effects is how social media seems to alter young girls' attitudes about female beauty and about body image. And for the most part, it alters them in negative ways. They think that the sort of curated model-like images that they see regularly, which are rarely representative of what real people actually look like, they think that those are the standards for beauty, and it makes them feel worse about themselves, right? About their own bodies. And this is one of many reasons why the negative effects of social media use on mental health are more pronounced in young girls than they are in young boys. Another thing involving manipulation is that some users are manipulated into changing their behavior through exposure to extreme emotional responses. So the algorithms are actually calibrated to try to get you to engage with content that is more likely to create extreme emotional responses, because that tends to generate the most clicks, right? The most engagement with the material. But if you engage in that kind of stuff enough, it can actually affect the way in which you behave, the way in which you consume content online, and to a lesser extent, it can trickle into affecting your attitudes and values. This is, maybe the easiest illustration would be with political content. If you keep getting fed political content that seems to push views that you disagree with, and you keep clicking on that stuff, then over time, your value, like if you keep thinking it's, this is nonsense, I don't like this, like what are these people talking about? And potentially maybe leaving comments on that stuff or engaging with it in some other way, it's going to reinforce some of those negative attitudes, but it's also going to make you more likely to engage with that content more in the future. So we know it's effective. We know that extreme emotional content is effective in getting people to click and engage, but it also tends to alter their behavior if they do it too much and over too long a period of time. And one that's come up in this class already is we spent like a whole week sort of talking about behavioral addiction and such. Social media is designed to be addictive. It is designed because if it's effective at being addictive, people are gonna use it more, right? So everything down to not just the way content is curated, but even the very dynamic of keeping track of likes and comments and giving you this endless barrage of notifications when things happen on your account. That stuff is all designed to get you to keep checking social media over and over again, day after day. And addiction is, as we discussed earlier in class, paradigm feature of it is it's not voluntary, is that it becomes a sort of a behavior that you can't really relinquish or let go of. And so if you develop a behavioral addiction to social media, you are not acting autonomously. So how do we fix or otherwise address these problems? The last section of the paper, there's a kind of a list that emerges of a bunch of possible things we could do. One thing the authors propose is that there's required reliability ratings for factual content or content that purports to be factual. This would enable people to differentiate information from disinformation, basically just being able to spot fake news without having to do the fact checking yourself. And that would help people not have their autonomy undermined by mistaking fake news for real news. Another thing is limiting doom scrolling, or in other words, the infinite scroll, right? The never-ending stream of just content continually filling up the bottom of the page, and disabling or at least radically limiting the autoplay of content on various sites. The idea here is that this gives the user more freedom regarding what content they want to view and when they want to stop viewing, because a lot of how we have traditionally engaged with media, we've had stopping points in how we engage with it, whether it be the end of a chapter in a book or the end of an article in a newspaper or the end of a magazine section or something like that. There was always an end point, right? A natural place, usually many natural places where we could stop reading. But if you have this infinite scroll, then you don't have any end point for when you are supposed to stop reading. It can just keep going forever. At the level of the sort of way social media platforms are designed, we could shift business models away from advertising altogether to try to limit the ways in which advertising, perniciously influences people's values and attitudes. But I have to be honest, I just don't see that particular suggestion coming into play anytime soon. All the social media platforms tend to be free to use and tend to make most of their money off of advertising. It's real. I think that would require a really dramatic sea change for how the business of social media is currently constructed. The good news is that they do have a suggestion for users that's thrown in with these, which is just use ad blockers when you're browsing. Do what you can to limit the number of ads that you are exposed to, because even though we are often not aware of the effects of advertising on us, their effectiveness is extremely well documented because they can influence our values and behaviors through changing our implicit associations with various phenomena. Those subtle effects can wind up being very powerful, especially given the sheer quantity of advertisements that you're exposed to on the internet. Another suggestion is to limit extremist and terrorist content on social media. So I think there are probably many reasons to do this that have nothing to do with promoting user autonomy. But the idea here is to essentially remove one source of emotionally extreme content, right? The kind of stuff that functions as clickbait but may wind up inadvertently pulling users into kind of a content black hole that they don't really want to go down, but they get sort of sucked in. And then I'm kind of clustering a few things together here, but also for users, they talk in one paragraph about, the authors talk about cultivating certain kinds of digital virtues like epistemic vigilance. This basically just means being a thoughtful consumer of content online and doing what you can to be aware of your media consuming behaviors. I liked these suggestions because, of course, you all have been doing that in the context of this class for the last 6 weeks with your media journals, right? Kind of keeping track of how much digital media you use in a particular week and reflecting a little bit on what you might like to change or what other observations you've noted about your behavior. So this is clearly related to some of the stuff that we're doing in the course. I would just say, as a general observation about this article, just make a note that we've talked in here a lot about the effects of social media and digital media more generally on mental health and on ways in which it seems to be in conflict with the pursuit of happiness, how too much, excessive use of these things seems to correlate with people being more unhappy. This is kind of just highlighting a different way to think about these problems. Like, most of us think that autonomy is in some way valuable. It's good for people to be able to make their own decisions and have some control over their own lives. The fact that social media in so many ways seems to be trying to undercut its users' autonomy may be another reason to limit your use of this particular digital technology. If nothing else, it does provide some reasons to pause and reflect a little bit on exactly how we engage with social media content and whether or not our engagement really is autonomous. So I'll leave you with those thoughts. And if you're in my class doing this as a makeup lecture, please also consult the assignment that is related to this course content.